Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us. My name is Sam Peterson. I serve as the Associate Director for Engagement with the Pacific Council of International Policy. Today, we are joined by Dr. Bruce Bennett, Rachel Minyoung Lee, and Jean Lee, who are going to have a fantastic conversation for you all to listen in on. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jean. Also, please, as questions come up throughout the conversation, please put the questions in the chat, and we will have about 20 minutes at the end for Jean to go through the questions. Looking forward to hearing from all of you. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the Pacific Council for organizing this discussion. Thank you to all of our participants for your interest in this topic. My name is Jean Lee. I am a journalist and an analyst, and I'm zooming in from Washington, D.C., where the weather is not as nice as it is in California. So in 2011, I became the first American journalist to join the Pyongyang Press Corps. And between 2008 and 2017, I made dozens of trips to North Korea. And many of those experiences make their way into my podcast for the BBC World Service. It's called The Lazarus Heist, and it is, of course, about North Korea. So I'm delighted to be joined by two of my fellow longtime North Korea watchers. You have their bios, but I will mention them briefly. Dr. Bruce Bennett is an adjunct international defense researcher with the RAND Corporation. He focuses on security issues in Northeast Asia, and a good chunk of his work does center on North Korea and the Korean Peninsula. And I'm very happy to be we're joined as well by Rachel Minyoung Lee. She's a senior analyst with the Open Nuclear Network based in Vienna, Austria. But she, before that, spent many, many years in Seoul, South Korea, providing the US government with really detailed North Korea analysis. So we are absolutely so lucky to have her sharing her insights, not just with the government, but with us, the broader audience. So there's a lot happening right now when it comes to North Korea. So I'm just going to take a minute to set the scene so we can start our discussion. I will point out that it's been nearly 4 years since the nuclear negotiations between Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, and Donald Trump, then the president of the United States, broke down in 2019, if I did my math right. And it's been just about 3 years since North Korea sealed its borders at the start of the COVID pandemic. And that act sealed the border, really severely restricted the flow of goods and people across that border. And there's no doubt in my mind that that has deepened the economic hardship that ordinary North Koreans were already facing. I should remind you that North Korea is one of the poorest countries in the world, but that has not stopped North Korea from carrying out an unprecedented number of ballistic missile tests this year, more than 70 at last count. And that includes the most recent rendition of an intercontinental ballistic missile that has been nicknamed the monster missile, and I'm hoping that our experts will talk a bit more about that. That was a missile that had people ducking for cover in Japan. And just overnight, we had news of an exchange of artillery or live fire drills on the South Korean side that triggered the North Korean assault of artillery at the border. So I'm just catching up on that news, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about that and what that could mean for the Korean Peninsula. So with today's discussion, I hope that we'll just unpack what all of this means, for the region, for us, for global security, for South Korea, and of course, for Kim Jong-un and for the North Korean people. What is Kim Jong-un's goal and what can be done to restrain him? So we'll start first with Bruce. Go ahead and take it away, Bruce.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk with you all from sunny Southern California, at least where I am in Southern California. We don't know a lot about North Korea directly. North Korea tries to deny us information. But from what we can make out, the regime has clear objectives. To me, the key three objectives are: one, the survival of the regime in power; number two, some form of Korean unification, though exactly what that is to be determined; and number three, the regime establishing itself as a great power in the region. All three of those objectives are actually intimately tied together and also tied to the pattern of North Korean provocations that we've been seeing this year. We have to recognize that within North Korea right now, there's a considerable degree of instability. The regime isn't feeding the people very well. They have COVID problems. They've closed their border with China, as Gina said, making it very difficult to provide goods and services that the people want. It is a difficult situation, and Kim is facing some challenges as a result. Not surprising, therefore, that he's taken a very aggressive path this year of missile launches, 60 some, we believe, including 8 ICBM launches. And the ICBM launches are directly a threat against the United States. So Kim is trying to make it clear that he can threaten the United States. Ultimately, in my mind, his objective is to break the US-ROC alliance. Unfortunately for him, his efforts have backfired since the incoming of the Yoon administration, because his missile launches have effectively caused closer US and South Korean relations rather than them being distanced. So Kim doesn't always get what he wants. Sometimes it doesn't work. We've seen this year a considerable amount of US and South Korean exercises and working together. Kim complains about that because he says, oh, those are preparing to get ready to invade North Korea. Well, we have to remember that many of the US and South Korean exercises are computer exercises. They're used to train staff. New staff, when they come in each summer, go to the Ulchi Freedom exercises that are done, which are computer simulations. There's no threat to North Korea in those. So we have to take with a grain of salt what North Korea says and the strength of their concerns. In fact, we have to recognize the stronger they speak and the more critical they are, the more revealing that is of the problems they're facing themselves and their need to divert attention away from their failings. Now, as we look at the current situation, North Korea has, as Jean said, tested now several times ICBMs this year, 8 total tests, of them 2 apparently successful tests of the Hwasong-17 missile. This is a very large missile. Now, they will claim it's the largest missile ever. It's actually smaller than the Titan II that the US deployed, but it is bigger than any other mobile missiles that are currently deployed in the world. So it's a large missile. It's capable of carrying multiple reentry vehicles, meaning a single missile could attack with nuclear weapons multiple targets. But North Korea has yet to display that kind of test capability, and that is a complicated capability to use. And so until they demonstrate it, probably don't have that capability. They could possibly deliver a single warhead missile or a missile with a single warhead, but even that they haven't really displayed. With these kinds of things, Kim has been trying to self-justify his position, to explain that the US is so hostile, when the US hasn't really been showing much hostility at all. It's been largely defensive in character. But Kim has to justify his position. Now, the concern that I think many people have at this stage is associated with what in the academic literature is called a nuclear shadow. That is, once countries develop a nuclear force of some modest size at least, they start becoming more aggressive in their provocations and in potentially their limited attacks. That's because they threaten the outside world, the US and South Korea in this case, with the potential that if we retaliate to their provocations, then they will escalate potentially to nuclear weapon use. And that causes us pause. So we have to be careful with how we respond to North Korea. But we also have to recognize that if we give North Korea a free ride, that doesn't help anything. We're supposed to be deterring North Korea from building more ICBMs, from building nuclear weapons, from testing these, but we don't see a great deal of US actions in that regard. Now, in fairness, the US doesn't have a lot of alternatives. Many of the economic options have been closed down. Many of the military options are not very attractive, though we've been using exercises. What is interesting is our potential use of information. We have to remember that Kim considers outside information absolutely, completely toxic. In fact, he has referred to K-pop as a vicious cancer, which is corrupting the morals of his younger generation. And if allowed to continue, could cause the regime to collapse like a damp wall. Well, think about the objectives I said at the beginning. There's nothing more important to Kim than his regime's survival. So outside information exploited appropriately with North Korea could be a real punishment, or more importantly, if threatened before he tests, a real inducement to him to deter him not to continue. The US hasn't done that very often. The US needs to be thinking about how we can use information to deter, coupled with all of the other actions we're trying to take. And with that, I'll stop my initial comments and be happy to talk in more detail in your questions.
Thank you. That was incredibly comprehensive, and you've given us a lot to talk about. I'm just going to say one thing, which is I absolutely agree with you about the threat of the flow of information, that's something that Kim Jong-un is trying to control. And I would argue, and I have argued, that the border closures, sealing that border at the start of the pandemic, was as much about their inability to deal with a pandemic because their health system is so weak, as it was to keep information out, to stop the flow of information. Because we have to remember that North Korea was coming off of failed negotiations in 2019, and he had to retrench, he had to pull back and think about, okay, how am I going to reframe this? And I think the pandemic, in a way, turned into an opportunity to shut that flow of information. And that comes at a very, very high price for the North Koreans in terms of the reliance on trade and the markets, but also the reliance on information from the outside world. So very good point. I hope we get back to it. A lot of other things that we want to follow up on, but I do want to give Rachel a chance to weigh in as well and give us her opening comments.
Thank you for your comments, Dr. Bennett, and Jean, thank you for those comments as well. I wanted to put North Korea's actions into a bit of a context. I think whenever North Korea does something like launching a missile, or when there's artillery firing by North Korea, when there's a statement, there's this tendency to unpack each action or statement from North Korea piecemeal. I think it is important to view North Korea's actions and statements holistically, and take a step back and look at them. I guess maybe take a broader view of their actions, like where they're coming from. So I guess the question everybody's asking is, what does Kim Jong-un want? Why is North Korea doing this? And I think in order to answer that question, it's important to think about the context of everything that's happening. I think we really need to go back to the failure of the Hanoi summit. I think that's really the root of all of this. I think when Kim Jong-un came back from Hanoi after the failed summit, I think it shook him up. And I think it has had a major impact on how he views the US and US DPRK relations. I think there was a little bit of a time where I think for a few months he still held on to that hope that maybe by the end of the year, the Trump administration might come up with a different proposal that's more palatable for Pyongyang. I think that the Kim summit, the Kim-Trump summit, the impromptu summit in Panmunjom in late June 2019, confirmed for Kim Jong-un that there would be the US has no intention of suspending the military exercises. And after the summit, unlike our expectations, because we had hoped that there would be progress after that summit, Instead, what we saw was a hardening of North Korea's foreign policy, of Pyongyang's line of US policy. And that culminated in Kim Jong-un's declaration of a quote unquote long-term confrontation with the US in his speech to the party plenary meeting in December of that same year. And I think this is the key expression, long confrontation with the US. And I think this is what underlies North Korea's behavior, why North Korea is behaving the way it is. North Korea believes that it's in for a long game. It's playing a long game. So it knows that any negotiations with the US will be difficult, that it's going to be a difficult road, that any positive outcome, if there is a positive outcome, won't come easy. So it's playing the long game, and I think the term long-term confrontation really captures that mindset. And in terms of the ongoing developments, and I think that really what's impacting North Korea's behavior now is really in line with what appears to be a shift in North Korea's 30 plus years of policy toward China and Russia, and possibly even the US. North Korea's policy toward China and Russia since the beginning of the 1990s, after the demise of the Soviet bloc, has been non-alignment with China and Russia, and normalizing relations with the US by working toward denuclearization, so eventual normalization of the US. And I think North Korea's statements from the foreign ministry since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I would even say after the Xi Jinping Putin joint statement, where they talked about no limits in friendship, that statement may have had an impact on Pyongyang's worldview. I think in that statement, North Korea saw a new global political order where, it's a multipolar world, one that is no longer led just by the US. I think it's, reinforced for Pyongyang that the US leadership on the global stage is waning, that it is not as powerful as it used to be. And so I think this worldview appears to have had a decisive impact in reshaping what I just mentioned, the 30 plus year policy on China and Russia, and possibly even the US. And the real significance of this policy shift, in my point of view, is where the US falls in North Korea's overall foreign policy. How necessary Pyongyang views the US is for its regime security, for improving the economy. And a review of Kim Jong-un's latest remarks seemed to suggest that there may be a fundamental change in how important the US is for North Korea's regime security. And I don't mean this to say that North Korea will never return to nuclear negotiations, but a change in how Pyongyang views the US will shape the form and outcome of any future nuclear negotiations. And this may run counter to the conventional wisdom that North Korea views the US as necessary for regime security. But I think with all of the statements that we have seen since the beginning of the year, North Korea's unprecedented number of missile launches, just the level of response that we saw from Pyongyang in response to the US ROK joint drills, military drills in September and October. With all of that in the backdrop, I think this is a question that might be worth asking. Where does the US stand in North Korea's foreign policy? And does Pyongyang view the US as absolutely necessary for its regime security? And I would like to take us a little bit to the domestic front in terms of why North Korea may be acting the way it is, and why, if indeed there has been a fundamental shift in how Pyongyang views the US, why that is, maybe from a domestic perspective. We talked a little bit about, North Korea's border closures after the outbreak of COVID in China. And when North Korea shut down its borders, many experts speculated that North Korea will not last for a long time in a state of self-isolation. It just can't last that long. And that North Korea's self-imposed isolation will have more impact than years of sanctions. And, you know, it's been about 3 years now, nearly 3 years, and North Korea's muddled through. And once again, it has proven to be resilient. And I think North Korea appears to have been emboldened by this success it has had in surviving this period of self-isolation. And this may have proven to Kim Jong-un and his associates that, that it can get by, that it does not need the US, at least for the near term, that it can get by. And I think this may have had some impact in terms of shaping Pyongyang's foreign policy. You know, Pyongyang's decision to pivot towards China and Russia, and perhaps a fundamental review of what the US means for Pyongyang. And that said, all of that said, I do think, though, that at some point, North Korea will have to cut back on its defense spending and start diverting more resources to the civilian economy, because Kim Jong-un, for years, since he came to power, has promised the people that he was going to improve the livelihood of the people. I think that when North Korea thinks it is the right time to return to negotiations, it will probably aim for arms control negotiations and not denuclearization negotiations. And if I may add one more thing, there has been a lot of speculation in the press over the last 2 or 3 weeks about the appearance of Kim Jong-un's daughter, Kim Joo-ae. And some experts have tied that to her appearance to a sign of confidence from Pyongyang, that, you know, Kim Jong-un brought out his daughter because, you know, he was successful at the launch. He was sure that the launch would be successful. I have a little bit of a different thought on that. The question I kept asking myself when I saw those pictures of Kim Jong-un's daughter in the media was, what compelled Pyongyang to go this far? Why did the North Korean leadership feel like they had to bring out the daughter? I mean, obviously it was to maximize the propaganda effect, but that's really the question. Why did they feel the need to maximize the propaganda effect? I think that Kim Joo-ae was meant to symbolize future generations. I think the messaging of her pictures was, we're in this. We are compelled to continue to develop our nuclear and missile programs for the security of our future generations. I think that was the main point of Kim Joo-ae's appearance. But still, the question remains, why did they feel the need to bring her out? Because that was going all out. You know, it could not have been an easy decision for Kim Jong-un to make, you know, bringing out your child like that to the public, you know, because they must have known all of the speculation and all of the wild theories that would abound in and outside of North Korea. So, yeah, that got me thinking about whether, you know, did Kim Jong-un have to prove to some segments of society that, you know, this is, we need to do this, that we need to keep doing this, and, you know, if that's the case, then that's, and I'm sure that, you know, he clearly felt the need to maximize the propaganda effect, but, you know, again, like, why? You know, is there some kind of pushback from some segments of society or even the leadership? And is that why they felt that that propaganda effect was necessary? So I'll stop here and
I completely agree with everything both of you have said. Now, I have to tell you that this is not always the case when you get a group of North Korea experts together. We often disagree, but I think that we're all on the same page here, which is interesting. I will just provide a little bit of context about the significance of Kim Jong-un bringing his daughter. First of all, his children have never been revealed. So when I was in Pyongyang, I did see Kim Jong-un's wife when she was pregnant. And so for me, talking with North Koreans, which I had to do in the North Korean dialect away from any minders, which I used to do, well, I'm not going to tell you my secrets, but I used to find places where I could speak to women in particular casually. And a lot of what we discussed was gossiping about whether she was pregnant and when the baby was due. So we did see her pregnant in the end of, I want to say it was the end of 2012. And the gossip on the street was that he wanted a boy in 2012. Well, what we know now is possibly that, and I'm not sure, none of us are sure whether Jue is the daughter born that year, and I do believe she was. Interestingly enough, the only person previously who had met her was Dennis Rodman, or I shouldn't say met her, but he had had a conversation with Kim Jong-un about his daughter Jue. Now, the South Korean intelligence believes he has 2 other children. I have never heard any gossip about 2 other children. But just to put this into context, Kim Jong-un himself was never revealed to the North Korean public until he made his formal debut in 2010. And that was the first time the North Korean people saw him. So his father, Kim Jong-il, kept the family in complete secrecy. He had many children, many consorts and wives, and kept them kind of secret. But what Kim Jong-un is doing by bringing his daughter out into public sphere is reminiscent of what his grandfather did. Kim Il-sung brought Kim Jong-il out. I think the North Koreans told me that the first time he was brought out in public was around the same age to a movie premiere. So it's very interesting, just to give you context on how unusual and why it is people like us think it's so, that why we're looking at this. And I completely agree with you that I think that it is about associating the nuclear program, this monster missile, with the Kim family. So as Dr. Bennett said, this is about the first point, I think it was the first point you made about maintaining control and Kim family control of North Korea, because the way Kim Jong-un has created it, or the Kim family has created it, is that North Korea's very existence relies on the Kim family. So you associate these big propaganda moments with the Kim family. Introducing the next generation is very interesting, especially because she's a female. I also wanted to just step back and remind you of we talked a lot about summits, but I just wanted to remind you of that timeline. So just to remind you that we had a surprise election. If I get this wrong, was it the fall of 2016? And during that handover from President Obama to President-elect Trump, President Obama apparently told him that North Korea would be his biggest foreign policy challenge. And so he perhaps decided he would take that on. So we saw a very focused President Trump on trying to resolve an issue that his predecessor couldn't resolve. I'm sure Dr. Bennett remembers, both of you remember this very clearly, because we were all watching very closely in 2017, 5 years ago, which reminds me so much of what's happening now. It was a year of unprecedented missile testing on the part of North Korea. Then we saw an abrupt shift in 2018 to diplomacy and détente. Those were the series of summits between North Korea and South Korea. Had a new engagement-focused President Moon Jae-in at the time. And the Singapore summit in 2018, and then the Hanoi summit was in February 2019, just to give you a little bit of that timeline. But then I will mention one more thing that we haven't mentioned, was that there was a presidential election in the fall of 2020. So I wonder how you two feel about the possibility that Kim Jong-un intends to wait out the Biden administration, that he's decided, I'm just going to pull back, build up my arsenal, make sure it's in a better place than it was when these negotiations fell apart in 2019. I think, Bruce, you made a really good point about needing to justify his position, and I would say perhaps also justify the allocation of resources that the North Koreans don't have in order to justify pouring that money into the nuclear program. And with that comes the need to raise tensions, to justify pouring money into the program. Before I turn to asking you a few questions, I did want to mention that absolutely, I think the a lot of experts were saying that those border closures were the toughest sanctions, that South Korea was like an own goal, like, sorry, North Korea was hurting itself with those sanctions. The bulk of my work focuses on sanctions evasion, which is how North Korea has turned to cyber to get around border closures and to get around sanctions. So I do believe that Kim Jong-un, very early on in his tenure, in his leadership, he's a young guy, he's a millennial, was educated in Switzerland, saw how we were using the internet, and very quickly started creating a cyber army to take advantage of the internet. And it's hard for us to imagine because it's a country that's very disconnected. Most people don't have access to the internet. But now what we're seeing is that, there's been this incredible investment in cyber, and the US State Department estimates that at least a third of its income is now from cyber. So hundreds of millions of dollars, just at least 600 million this year alone attributed to North Korean hacking. So something that we need to think about in terms of how it is they're getting around those border closures and those sanctions. Now, Bruce, I wanted to ask you to help put into context the significance of that monster missile that you mentioned. Now, you said, I think for our audience, it's important to explain what the significance is of that development, that has multiple, that is capable of carrying multiple warheads. And the question I have is, are you afraid that they're going to launch an attack, especially given some of the changes in their language about the use of nuclear force? Can you talk a little bit about that, and whether that you still see this as largely defensive, or do we need to worry that they're going to put a nuclear warhead and fire that toward us at some point?
Well, let's take it in two parts: the nuclear threat in the theater versus the nuclear threat against the US. Note that in October, Kim Jong-un was very clear that they were practicing firing tactical nuclear weapons at ports, to neutralize airfields, and to destroy military command and control facilities. Well, having worked for decades on nuclear weapons, I can tell you what the US considers a tactical nuclear weapon will not neutralize an airfield. It's too small. You have to have a much bigger yield, which suggests that Kim has a different definition of a tactical nuclear weapon than we do. He still wants a large yield weapon, I believe, like his sixth test or bigger, to use against those kinds of targets in order to neutralize them or destroy them, as he said. And that means that we're misunderstanding the kind of thing he's been saying, because he can use those same weapons to attack the United States. That size weapon put down on New York City, for example, would cause somewhere between 2 and 3.5 million significant casualties or fatalities. We're talking big deal. So if that's what he's working on, he is posing a serious threat against the United States. Why is he doing that? He's doing that because the US offers a nuclear umbrella guarantee to South Korea. South Korea, the US says, don't develop nuclear weapons, we'll cover you. We've got your back. If North Korea ever uses nuclear weapons, we'll respond with nuclear weapons. And what Kim wants to do is to pose such a threat against the United States, being able to fire multiple weapons that could cause millions of people each damage in the US, that a US president will step back and say, maybe I won't do that. Or more importantly, that Iraq president will say, I can't trust the US to do that. I'm not sure they will. And so what you hear in Seoul now is considerable discussion about whether South Korea needs its own nuclear weapons program, which is directly reflective of this and a byproduct. I don't think Kim wanted that, but he's certainly gotten it. But also, if we don't do that, let's at least get US nuclear weapons back on Korean territory. And the problem with that is, what South Korean's going to volunteer to have nuclear weapons stored near his home? making himself nuclear target number one? Moreover, are the progressives going to accept either Iraq nuclear weapon program or US-tac nukes brought back in? That could cause considerable dissension within South Korea and political division. So it's creating a difficult situation in South Korea. I think we face a Korean leadership that's got some tough decisions ahead, and a US leadership that's going to be forced by the ICBMs as they develop to make some difficult decisions as well.
Rachel, feel free to jump in. I do think that you're raising another point, which is if we don't think the North Koreans are suicidal and are going to perhaps launch a weapon offensively, a nuclear device, what are the other consequences? And I do think I'm seeing more and more from South Korea, these calls for South Korea to protect themselves. Is this, you live there for a very long time. You're still very much in touch with how South Koreans feel. Are you hearing this? Is this something we need to worry about when it comes to a possible arms race in Northeast Asia? Does this feel real to you? Is this something we should worry about beyond perhaps North Korea striking us with a nuclear weapon?
I think the more we have this, escalation going on, and if there is, well, I guess it's a matter of time when there is a seventh nuclear test. I think it will certainly revive that topic, and it already has, with all of the escalation we saw in the fall, about whether South Korea should have its own nuclear program. Whether all this talk about nuclear sharing with the US, redeploying US tactical nuclear weapons, whether those scenarios are feasible or not, I think it is significant that those discussions have come to the surface, to the fore. And
go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, keep going.
And, I worry that, if we continue to see those types of discussions in the South Korean public, and sometimes we've seen South Korean politicians floating similar ideas as well back in the fall when we had that escalation between the two Koreas. I do worry that might put strain on the U.S. ROK alliance if this is not handled or managed properly. Because we know that the U.S. government's position is extended deterrence, strengthening extended deterrence to South Korea and Japan. So
I do want to get to the question of arms control, which both of you are very familiar with. And I think we should talk about why it is that the United States and other countries are not ready to recognize North Korea as a nuclear power, which I believe is what Kim Jong-un wants. And Bruce, you alluded to that. Dr. Bennett, you alluded to that earlier. Can we talk about this? Bruce, can you talk about what the pros and cons are when it comes to recognizing North Korea as a nuclear power? Is that inevitable? Are there reasons why that's not going to happen?
Well, effectively, we are recognizing it as a nuclear power. But officially recognizing it, that gives Kim Jong-un just this major feather in his cap. And so the US government is reluctant to do that. I think there's also fear on the US government side that if we do that, we give a lot more incentive to our Korean allies to have their own nuclear weapon program, to balance against North Korea. I've been shocked to see some of the polls that suggest that roughly a plurality of South Koreans think that North Korea is militarily superior to South Korea, largely because of the nuclear weapons. And they're not counting the US nuclear weapons. They don't feel confident that they can do that. This is an issue which the US has really got to come to grips with, and its major failure is its failure to do things to deter the North Korean provocations, their tests. I mean, if South Koreans can't trust the US to stop the North Korean program development, are they really going to be confident that they can trust us to respond with nuclear weapons when our cities would be targeted in response? So we have some real decisions to make on the US side about if we want extended deterrence to work, don't we have to do a little bit more work at trying to control the current situation?
And if
So
I
Rachel, go ahead.
if I may just add to Dr. Bennett's comments, I think, you mentioned South Korean public's confidence in the US coming to South Korea's aid if South Korea comes under attack. And I think the Trump administration's, former President Trump's comments about the US ROK military drills being war games or war exercises. I think what we saw during the US South Korea negotiations over the defense sharing costs and just this, I guess, shift towards more US centered policies. I think have sort of had this effect of maybe, bringing this question in the minds of the South Korean public, can we really rely on the US 100%? Don't we need our own defense mechanism? That's 100% our own. I think that has really...
I'm curious how you would feel if for whatever reason we went down a path where we recognized North Korea as a nuclear power, which would mean that, like the United States and other countries in that small club, that North Korea Kim Jong-un would be able to hold on to nuclear weapons forever and talk about denuclearization in the same way that the United States does. To him, I think that is what he wants, right? Is to be able to champion peace and denuclearization while holding on to his nuclear weapons. How would you feel? How would your family members in South Korea, my parents also live in South Korea, feel if North Korea were to join that club and the threat of nuclear weapons was just forever hanging over the Korean Peninsula?
I think many people, I mean, we've already seen poll results in February 2022 conducted by the Chicago Council, that more than 70% of the South Korean public believes that South Korea needs its own nuclear program. And I think if we were to officially recognize North Korea as a nuclear power, then I think people will question whether we don't need our own nuclear weapons. Because then that would be true deterrence, right? Because if you have a neighbor that has nuclear weapons and they're officially recognized, then how do you protect yourself, really?
And the US has practiced extended deterrence because if our ally South Korea goes nuclear, there's some chance Japan will also go nuclear.
Yeah.
And if two of our principal allies go nuclear, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty may well be dead. And that treaty has been the key to US nuclear non-proliferation policy. Mm-hmm. So the US would prefer that not to happen, but we certainly have to be doing more than we're doing now if we don't want it to happen.
I think it's very important. Sometimes I find that it's hard to talk about the threat when we have a conflict in Ukraine, but I think that it's important to talk about the implications for proliferation and also what kind of example we'd be setting for other rogue nations or other countries that may look at North Korea as an example for how you follow that path. And so not doing anything also sends the wrong signal, as you say. Now, I think we should open up to some of the questions from the audience. I do think we need to talk a bit more about China. I do want to ask a question from Alex Barker. Let me just read this out. As China looks to achieve hegemony over East Asia, North Korean provocations against Japan and the ROK only push those countries closer to the US orbit as they look for security. Do you see any scenarios where China will try to rein in North Korea's show of force to weaken the case for US security cooperation with Japan and South Korea? This is a very good question. Who wants to take that one on? Or you both can. There are a lot of elements of this, and I will add a question to that once you respond.
Let me start out by saying that I think from China's perspective, it's not entirely upset that that pressure is being put on China, on South Korea and Japan, because it suggests to those countries that the US may not be reliable in its extended deterrent. And so by doing that, it's putting pressure on the alliances, and would certainly be just as happy as North Korea would be for the alliances to fail. What China seems to be missing, though, is North Korean nuclear weapons aren't just a threat to us. I have a student who has just finished her graduate school program, got her PhD. Her dissertation was on the North Korean nuclear threat to China. Not something we normally think about. But
Can we hear a bit more? I'm so curious what the paper says.
Well, I'd be happy to send you a copy or the link to download her dissertation. RAND publications are all downloadable free, and she lays it out very clearly.
I think partly because we don't often get to hear the Chinese point of view from the DC or the US perspective. So I always find it valuable. I will mention, you make a very good point, because I will mention that the last, if both of you recall, we had 2 nuclear tests in, oh my gosh, was it 2016? And I have the USGS earthquake alert set. This goes back to my days when, you know, Korea doesn't get a lot of big earthquakes. So often your first alert is a warning or an alert from USGS saying there's been an earthquake in a certain part of North Korea. And that is always, for me, the first indication that there is a nuclear test. But I do remember, so just a reminder that those 2 nuclear tests were followed by very stiff UN Security Council resolutions that China signed on to. Please correct me if I'm misremembering this.
True.
Do we think that China will change its tune? So far, they've vetoed the most recent attempts to bring about more UN Security Council resolutions. Do we think a nuclear test would change China's tune or China's approach? Will that be, is that a red line as it was in 2016, or are things different now? Will China just let North Korea continue testing even with a nuclear device?
I think it depends upon what you see. If I'm Kim Jong-un, I want my 7th nuclear test not to be 10 kilotons, which is what roughly the 1st through the 5th tests were. I want it to be 500 kilotons, because by making a huge explosion, I demonstrate that I really am a nuclear power. So, but if they do that, I think China is going to feel compelled to react. So I think exactly how North Korea plays this will determine a lot about the Chinese reaction.
Because the Chinese were not happy about that 6th nuclear test. And for them, it's a safety issue, right?
Oh,
I mean, they destroyed an entire mountain. God knows what happened in terms of the environment. And it was not far from the border, right? That is just too close to home for the Chinese.
So if they do a larger yield test, think about it. Can they really do it in that location? Probably not. Could they conceivably put it on a ballistic missile and launch it out over the East Sea of Japan? They could, claiming China's 4th nuclear test was on a ballistic missile. So they're just doing what China did. That would really infuriate China. But so we have to consider the different possibilities and hopefully tell North Korea, don't you dare do that.
And they've been underground so far. Is there any risk they might take it above ground?
Well, that's what I'm suggesting, putting it on a ballistic missile.
Or should we not go there? Let's not think about it. What's next in terms of so you think it's capacity, you think it's power?
I think that's what Kim wants. I think Kim,
and that would still have to be underground.
To demonstrate to us that he's really powerful.
I wonder if now, under the current circumstances, and just looking ahead as we think about a potential cross-strait conflict, right? You know, there's been a lot of talk about Xi Jinping, you know, Taiwan, possibly taking over Taiwan. sort of in that context, in the long run, I do wonder if North Korea's value for the Chinese will go up if China is thinking more in that broader, longer term context. And if that's the case, whether Beijing might be willing to overlook a seventh nuclear test by the North Koreans.
I think the other kind of thing that we need to think about, though, is the North Koreans recognize that China is not necessarily their ally. I understand from the various senior defectors, escapees that I've talked to, that in North Korea, the North Koreans typically say, Japan is our enemy of 100 years, China is our enemy of 1,000 years. So I think North Korea will be very careful with China, both not to antagonize it, but also not to become dependent upon it.
So my sound cut out for a bit, so I may have missed something, but I do also want to ask, is China using North Korea against the in its sort of competition with the United States? Is there any benefit to China to kind of keep North Korea on side?
Oh, yes. I mean, North Korea can antagonize the US and has been regularly. And what do? They launched 8 ICBMs this year, and we've taken very little in the way of response to that kind of thing. So we're easing off of what we consider to be a red line, what we consider to be unacceptable. That's good for China. China thinks that that's extending their ability to exercise power in the region by undermining the US ability to exercise power. For China, this is a zero-sum game in Northeast Asia, I believe.
Can we talk about Russia a bit and the impact of the Ukraine war? And what we need to keep in mind about how that may have deepened some of the global, the division, the global divide, and how North Korea might be taking that into account. Is that something you both are looking at?
Well, I think the Ukraine situation has certainly, proven to Kim Jong-un that, when you have nuclear weapons, the US will not be attacking you. I think that's one major lesson learned for North Korea. And all the more reason why he would probably not give up his nuclear weapons. I think North Korea is definitely keeping an eye on, Russia's, the Ukraine situation, and Russia, what that means for Russia. And I think it will have an impact on North Korea's position on the Russians. But for now, they have definitely, sort of dashed towards the Russians since the invasion of Ukraine. The level of endorsement, in the various official statements, like we had never seen before, not in recent years. So I think, North Korea is pragmatic. So, this policy may change, but I think it will have how the situation unfolds in Ukraine will have an impact on Pyongyang's policy on Russia.
I think Rachel's exactly right. I mean, look, the US is not providing Ukraine with weapon systems that they can use to attack Russian territory. So isn't that exactly what North Korea would want, that the US would give South Korea weapon systems that can't attack North Korean territory? Now we've given them lots of weapon systems that can, but maybe because of nuclear weapons over time, we will be more restrained in what we provide. And so I think the Russian example with Ukraine is really a critical example for North Korea, just like Libya was. I mean, Libya, Kim Jong-un saying, that fool Gaddafi giving up his ability to develop nuclear weapons. So I think we've had several cases where the power of nuclear weapons has clearly been demonstrated, and Kim loves it.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know how many times North Koreans have mentioned Libya as a case study for why they need to hold up to their nuclear weapons, and also Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine itself, they could probably also argue that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons and so was vulnerable to invasion. I think also the deepening of the relationship between Russia and North Korea, which really wasn't, it's really tailed off since the days when the Soviets were really backing, the days of the Soviet support of North Korea. But I am seeing some reports. There's a report in Radio Free Asia, RFA, about the rail line opening up between Russia and North Korea so that the North Koreans can help with supplies, whether it's uniforms. We're seeing reports, of course, about artillery. I did want to give each of you I have a last question for each of you, which is, what should we watch for in the coming months? And do you have some work that you can share with us so that people can go to anything you've published recently that you'd like the audience to take a look at? So maybe we'll start, Bruce, if you would like to give me your quick take on what you'll be watching for in the coming months or weeks or days when it comes to North Korea.
Well, I think the overall pattern of provocation, number one, launches of ICBMs, number two, but especially a seventh nuclear test is something to watch for. We may not be seeing that yet because one of the things Kim may be getting from Russia in response to artillery and other things provided is nuclear weapon design expertise. You never know. And so he may be fitting that into the seventh test, and that's taking some time. Recent activities, you can go to the RAND website, www.rand.org, Bruce-Bennett. And when you go there, you'll see the publications I've done, op-eds. I have an op-ed on using information against Kim Jong-un, in particular K-pop. Okay. But I also have two reports recently, one on the North Korean nuclear weapon threat and a second on their chemical, biological, EMP, and cyber threats. So those are all available, free downloads.
Great. And Rachel, what are you watching in the upcoming weeks?
I think it's important. So in 2017, it seemed like we were going to go to war, right? There was talk of fire and fury and North Korea's endless missile tests. And then in a matter of months, we saw this diplomacy, right? North Korea's diplomatic overtures. I don't think we're going to see something like that now, because I think we're in a different phase, unfortunately. But it would still be interesting for me personally to see if there might be something between North Korea and the US. I'm not too hopeful. In the near term, I don't think North Korea is going to come back to the negotiating table. I think they're probably not going to come back until they've made a substantial amount of progress on their 5-year defense development plan, unless there's something very, very tantalizing for Kim Jong-un, which I don't think the Biden administration will go for. But still, it would be interesting to see if we can see some signs of diplomacy, maybe even at the 1.5 track level, or something, maybe not at an official level.
Absolutely, it's a matter of timing, right, on Kim Jong-un's part. I will be covering some of that, what I call Fire and Fury of 2017 in the second season of my podcast, The Lazarus. So I'm going to make a pitch if you want to learn a bit more about what Bruce was talking about in terms of cyber. I want to thank both of you. This was incredible. I could probably pick your brains for hours, but just want to thank you and then hand it back over to the Pacific Council team to close us out.
Thank you so much, Jean, Dr. Bennett, Rachel. This was an amazing conversation. Thank you to all of our members who tuned in, asked some questions and stuff. I feel like I learned a ton, and we hope to see you all soon. That's it from us today. Have a great rest of everyone's Mondays. Bye now.